So good morning, everyone. My name's Stuart Thompson, and I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of the Good Business Foundation, or the GBF as we like to call it. At the GBF, our thesis is pretty simple: good business equals good lives. We have a focus in supporting small and medium businesses in emerging markets and communities. The GBF is proud to be partnering with AIDN on this three-part webinar series, addressing global issues with impact investing. AIDN's message is simple: more and better giving and investing from Australia to international development. One of the ways AIDN is going about this is by showcasing and amplifying the work and issues in the sector. Today is part two of this sessions, and we look forward to hearing from a panel with deep knowledge and history in this area of work. But I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands we're all tuning in from today. I'm on pretty cold, actually, Wadawurrung country, now known as Geelong, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank my Indigenous brothers and sisters for their understandings of the seasons, and that winter time is actually a time for renewal and growth, not darkness and isolation. Today's session will be hosted by Clay O'Brien. Clay works as an advisor in access and finance and economic development. He was based in Myanmar from 2019 to 2021, initially to take up the role as CEO of a microfinance institution. Clay's previous positions include the Managing Director of AIDN, Inclusive Financial Sector Consultants. He spent 18 months in Indonesia running an agricultural finance project. He's been a Senior Specialist for Financial Inclusion at AusAid, now known as DFAT, or within DFAT, and various roles within the Global Microfinance Network, Opportunity International. In total, Clay has worked within the international development sector for over 18 years. Prior to that, he was the CEO of an investment bank and began his career as a lawyer. Over to you, Clay.
Thanks very much, Stuart. And it's great that GBF has kindly sponsored this series. And this is, as people know, the second in a series of three. Before we get on with the discussion, I just wanted to introduce our esteemed panel, starting with Kristy Graham. Kristy is the inaugural Executive Officer of Australian Sustainable Finance Institute. Prior to ASFI, Kristy led the Australian government's work with private and institutional investors to mobilise capital for climate and social impact in Australia, Southeast Asia and the Pacific. And in this role, she established the Australian government's first impact investment fund, the Emerging Markets Impact Investment Fund, which we'll be talking about later. It was designed to build sustainable and inclusive financial markets in Southeast Asia. Kristy was also a senior advisor, special advisor on the Prime Minister's Social Impact Investing Task Force in 2020. And she's previously worked in Latin America, the UK, and in various global roles for large and small organizations. Secondly, we have Richard Marney. Richard is a senior advisor for risk management at Responsibility Investments, a Zurich-based development finance focused asset management firm. He previously served as the firm's chief risk officer. And prior to Responsibility, Richard had a broad and varied 40-year career in emerging and frontier markets in banking and principal investment, with senior level business and corporate development, risk management and operating roles, including with Bank of New York Mellon and JP Morgan. Richard currently sits on several boards of directors in the emerging markets, including the African Guarantee Fund, Trustco in Namibia, Micro Capital and Finca. And thirdly, we have Jeremy Cleaver. Jeremy is currently an independent development finance consultant, engaged with clients such as EMIF, the Australian government fund I mentioned, and the Asian Development Bank, focusing on impact investing, private sector development, MSME finance, and financing growth issues in emerging markets. Between 2011 and 2020, Jeremy was a director of the African funds business of CDC, the British Development Finance Institution, and CDC is now known as British International Investment. Between 2018 and 2020, Richard was also head of CDC's Johannesburg office, where he is responsible for managing both the office and CDC's relationships with the UK government and other stakeholders. Prior to joining CDC, Jeremy worked for the Asian Development Bank in Sydney as a private sector development specialist. And before that, he was an investment banker at Macquarie Bank and Goldman Sachs. And in the first half of his career, Jeremy lived and worked in China and Hong Kong. For those who were able to tune in 10 days ago, the first session set the scene on the evolution of capital in working towards supporting development outcomes, mapping out some of the history from beginnings around microfinance. This session will consider in more depth the spectrum of current offerings from impact investing through concessional capital to market rate returns. The panel will discuss the opportunities and challenges at each level and how these may be seen in an emerging market context. But let me share my screen. I just wanted to show a few slides, including one from the previous session, just to give people a bit more background on what we were doing, some of the discussions last time, and that will also help with what we want to discuss today. So impact investing we had a good discussion 10 days ago just to introduce impact investing and to give it a quick definition. Essentially, investments made with the intention to generate positive, measurable social and environmental impact alongside a financial return. There's a whole spectrum now that's developed. So this screen shows you where the market has come from and what are some of the variations at the moment. So on the far right-hand side, you have the traditional philanthropy, which then moved into more venture philanthropy. And on the far left-hand side, traditional investing with a focus mainly or purely on financial return. Then between the two, we have a whole range now of offerings that are now available in the market. 15, 20 years ago, responsible investing started. Sometimes it was simply a negative screen to take out from an investment fund investments that were seen as inappropriate, such as perhaps tobacco. Then it became more sustainable investing. So looking for more development outcomes, not simply screening out inappropriate investments. And then the right-hand side moved across. So you had impact first funds that were set up with primarily an impact focus, but also some sort of financial return. And microfinance was an early example of that. And then moving a little bit further to the left, you now have funds which focus first on finance, but also have an impact investing criteria as well. So there's a whole spectrum of available investments that you can make in order to participate in what's broadly called impact investing. This shows some of the research that's been done by a group called the Global Impact Investing Network. They put out an annual report. It's based on a survey they do of a large number of impact investing participants. And what they've plotted over the last 5 years or so is just the growth in impact investment. Initially, they just published the numbers from their own participants, but then starting in 2019, they made estimates of the size of the market. And you can see the incredible growth over that, just over that 4-year period, from less than $100 billion in impact investing funds to over $700 billion over that period. And as for this part of the world, it's not a huge contributor to the global number. As you can see, looking on the left-hand side, which shows the percentage of assets under management, the right-hand side is the participants who responded to the GIN survey. But if looking on the left-hand side, you can see that that North America contributes nearly a third of impact investing funds. Our region, I mean, Oceania's around 5%, Southeast Asia around 3%. So still quite a small contributor to the overall impact investing world. I mentioned before microfinance, which even before the term impact investing was invented, was really a recipient of impact investing funds. Going back over 20 years, various microfinance investment vehicles were set up, including where Richard works at Responsibility. They were one of the very first. But there's been a huge change over the last 20 years. In the last 4 years, the finance sector, which includes microfinance and financial services generally, has gone from about 27% to around 20% of those assets under management. At the same time, we've seen huge growth from other areas, such as forestry, food and agriculture, housing, healthcare, WASH. A whole range of development sectors now are being structured in order to attract impact investing funds. Today, we wanted to move the discussion forward into this whole area of blended finance, which is essentially using catalytic or concessional capital from public or philanthropic sources to increase private sector investment into sustainable development. So if you think back to the first slide I showed you, where you had a whole range of different impact investors, what blended finance does is try to bring some of those together into the one fund or activity. So you would have the more public, such as government or philanthropic sources, which are on the right-hand side of that graph, now working with some of those that have a more finance-first perspective in order to work together to increase the volume of impact investing. So I've summarized here three of the funds or programs that have been set up by the Australian government. I mentioned the EMIF fund before, and we'll hear a little bit more about that from both Kristy and Jeremy, who are involved. Investing in Women is another project set up by the Australian government, which uses grants to catalyse private investment into women-owned SMEs in the region. The idea being that the government makes a grant, which then reduces the risk and then makes it more attractive for private investors to support those ventures. And thirdly, we have the Australian Climate Finance Partnership. And that's an initiative where the government has worked with the Asian Development Bank, providing up to 140 million to accelerate private sector investment into low emission climate resilient solutions for our region. So they're just three examples. I mean, but what is likely to happen under the new government is we may well see an increase in this type of activity. And in fact, the Labor government announced before the election that they would set up a review into development finance, which should look at these types of vehicles and some of the issues that perhaps hold them back and opportunities to increase this type of activity. All right, that's enough from me. I wanted to now sort of bring the panel in, and initially I'll ask each of the panelists to give us their perspective on the impact investing world from their perspective. So I'll start with Richard. So as mentioned, Richard's been working in frontier markets and development finance for around 4 decades, including a time when we were both at the Microfinance Network Opportunity. So Richard, I'd ask if you can comment on the changes you've seen over that period. In some of the areas that I touched on with the slides, such as the industry sectors in which impact investing is happening and the stakeholders involved. Over that period, as impact investment has expanded to include a range of different offerings.
Thank you very much, Clay, and welcome to all the participants. We're very pleased that you've been able to join us. A lot has changed over the last 20 years in particular. I think when Clay and I were working in separate situations, but eventually together, impact investing was, as Clay pointed out, limited to microfinance for the most part. Secondly, much of the funding was donor donations from institutions and individuals. If you play the tape forward to June of 2022, it's a very different landscape. First, as Clay's slide very well presented, you can add a long list of sectoral focuses for the investment universe. Renewable energy, both solar home systems and C&I activity, biomass, hydro, low-income housing, private education. You go on to a variety of others, water sanitation, etc. Secondly, and relevant for our discussion today, is the nature of the financial support has changed. Firstly, blended finance, meaning the combination, as we know, of various sources of funding with varying objectives for their intervention. Up and down the capital structure now, we see everything from senior unsecured debt down through traditional private equity. These create challenges for all of us, both as investors and investees. I think thirdly, there's been microfinance always had a focus on gender equality, but I think increasingly we're seeing programs that are explicitly designed to address that. At the African Guarantee Fund, where I'm a director, in coordination with the African Development Bank, 2 years ago, we established a program called AFAWA, which is specific to support female-led SMEs, both in the region generally, but with a specific focus on fragile states. And so I think that in summary then, asset allocation is over a broader set of sectors, and the underlying financing is multifaceted, and as a result, more complex and requires all of us to have our thinking caps on. Clay?
Thanks, Richard. Kristy, I'll turn to you next, if I may. After nearly 10 years at DFAT, and including the 2 years when I was there, you really led the work on development and climate finance, but you left last year to become the executive director at the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute. Perhaps if you could tell us a little bit about that organisation, and then the changes in impact investing that you've seen over the last decade from your public sector perspective.
Sure, thanks very much. It's great to be here. I'm joining from Ngunnawal country here in Canberra, so nice to see you all. So the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute that I joined in November last year was established by a group of 21 large financial institutions in Australia who are really committed to working together and working with others, with government, with universities right across the finance sector to realign the financial services system, so more money flows to activities that will create a sustainable, resilient and inclusive Australia. So to your point, Clay, showing the spectrum up at the beginning, recognition that the finance sector and mainstream finance in particular has a really strong role to play in scaling up that impact side of the spectrum and thinking much more coherently and constructively about the risk side as well to be better integrating ESG risks into all mainstream financial decision making. So ASFI is a relatively new organisation. There's a lot of energy and support around the opportunities that exist for deployment of capital to solutions in particular, and thinking around and working with government on the policy and regulation, as well as sort of tools, frameworks, and other collaborative efforts that are required to enable financial institutions to do that at scale. So in terms of how I've seen, sort of from my perspectives, impact investing developing, I think what we've seen over the last decade is very much a transformation, impact investing and discussions around that, the interest from mainstream financial institutions 10 years ago was very much focused in developed markets like the EU, the US. But I think what we've seen is an evolution and a penetration of impact investing sort of as a concept and a practice and growth in markets much more towards emerging markets. And that's really sort of taken off, I think, off the back of strong developed country government use of their development finance institutions and recognising the value that they play as part of broader development cooperation and action on climate. So using, for example, BII or the DFC in the US to both catalyse sort of economic growth and market development in emerging markets, but also to bring a strong impact focus to more commercial transactions and really grow the impact investing market from that sort of commercial direction as well. It's from an impact direction. The other thing I think we've seen is mainstream capital really starting to take impact a lot more seriously and thinking about not always moving straight to an allocation for impact products, but to integrating both the impact that their investment in their portfolio is having on a range of sustainability and social impact issues and thinking through that sort of at a holistic lens. So climate has clearly been a driver for this uptick in interest from mainstream capital, but I do think we're also seeing, I would agree with Richard, that off the back of sort of donor and development finance institution interest and activity, we're seeing gender and other impact issues really coming to the fore in those considerations as well. The last thing I'll mention is, I guess, how DFAT's portfolio and program evolved over that time. So I guess in a similar way to many of the organisations on this call today, DFAT was traditionally very much a grant-only donor and was very comfortable providing grants to support impact objectives that it had right across the region. And so when we started first thinking about, well, how do we support the growth of the impact investing market, it started from that grant-based sort of approach. So working with market building organisations like the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs, the Global Impact Investing Network, to try and build some of that global knowledge and understanding into the region and build market infrastructure around impact investing. We've seen that very successfully kind of grow and scale up, and as well as DFAT's, I guess, level of sophistication and appetite for doing more to stimulate market development and growth by being a direct investor. And Clay, you mentioned the Emerging Markets Impact Investment Fund, the Australian Climate Finance Partnership, the Investing in Women program. There's now a portfolio of programs that use a range of different approaches to build and support the growth of the impact investing market right across Southeast Asia and the Pacific.
Great, thanks, Kristy. And lastly, turning to you, Jeremy, like me, you started in the evil world of investment banking before seeing the light and joining ADB in 2008, and that was about the time that we met. And I mentioned your decade with the UK DFI, leading their African funds work. Now, as an independent advisor, one of the things you do is sit on the investment committee of EMIF. But over that 14-year period, what's your perspective on the changes in the impact investing landscape?
Well, thanks, Clay. And I think Kristy set up my comments pretty well by talking about the importance of some of the DFIs. I was really lucky to have joined CDC at a time when I joined in 2011, I think there were 2 people focused on impact within CDC. There was obviously a significant ESG team, but really impact at that time was a concept that I think people had discussed, but nobody really had a solid idea or a consistent idea maybe of what impact meant for them or their institutions. And over the nearly 10 years at CDC, I think I should call it BII. It's really hard for me to do that now. I was there for 10 years and they've just recently changed their name. They developed their impact team from 2 people to probably 60 plus people. They now think about their contribution, how they contribute, and then what, who, and how much. And it is a process that is deeply embedded into their investment process. And so I think over 10 years or so, they've moved from a pure focus on ESG to having embedded impact people in their investment teams, and really thinking at a at a rubber hits the road level what the impact of their investments are. There's still it's still a blended finance approach. It's still a very much a commercial approach, but focused on the impact in emerging markets at the base of the pyramid. And so CDC goes as far as, you know, in the education sector, thinking about the number of students, in the power sector, thinking about the number of homes serviced by extending power networks, etc. It's a really very deep and detailed approach. In addition to that, they've also built now specific gender lens and diversity investing groups, as well as a core focus on climate change, which sort of keys off the comments that both Richard and Kristy made about the industry more broadly. And I think CDC or BII, as one of the older development finance institutions, went through that process at a time when it was really beneficial for the broader market, as Kristy said. You know, they have published a lot of their handbooks on their website and tried to bring people along with them, both other DFIs, but also commercial investors and others that are looking at emerging markets, which has been fantastic. And then moving from there into my current role, I guess particularly relevant is my IC position with EMIF. It's really fantastic to see the Australian government over the last 5 or 10 years take the steps that it has, and much of that has been led by Kristy, to really grab hold of impact and try and do what might be most effective for the Australian government to do in Southeast Asia and the Pacific and elsewhere, focused on gender lens and then more and more on the climate side. So let me stop there for now, but I think keen for the rest of the conversation. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Jeremy. We'll go on and discuss a few other topics, but I just wanted to remind all the participants that there is a Q&A box. So we will allow time at the end for any questions that come from participants. So please don't hesitate to pop any thoughts or questions you have into the Q&A box, and we'll address those as we go. But I next wanted to just drill down a little bit more on this idea of impact first versus finance first. You're all involved in or have been involved in various institutions, but maybe you could just talk a little bit about, perhaps Richard, if you want to lead off just talking about responsibility. I mean, do you think they take an impact first or finance first approach, or is it somewhere in the middle? And does it actually depend on the specific opportunity? Do they sometimes take one approach as opposed to the other when they look at a particular investment?
That's a very good question. A very, very good question. I think, like our industry, of which all of our colleagues are speaking today, responsibilities, posture, strategy, if you will, has evolved over its 17 years of existence. The program started with a very simple thesis that individuals were looking for ways to have their money combine some moderate or modest return with a keen social and economic impact on the parties in the emerging and frontier markets. And so it was very definitely that focus. Over time, as we have moved into areas where we have attracted blended finance, clearly the balance has shifted a bit, but the fundamental double bottom line strategy has not changed. That having been said, certainly if you go into some of the areas, perhaps using renewable energy as one example of many, in order for the achievement of the kinds of returns to sustain our catalytic, and when I say ours, I mean everyone on this call, focus of the capital. There has had to be sometimes a greater commitment to achieving what would be traditional market and internal rates of return. So it's a fuzzy answer because it's a fuzzy reality. It varies and it's changing. Ultimately, as a coda, I would say that to make this a sector of which we can be proud of its impact, we can never deviate from the double bottom line, and the challenge is keeping that balance. Thank you, Clay.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, Kristy, do you want to comment? Or
Sure. So Australian Sustainable Finance Institute, many of our members are fiduciary investors, so super funds, asset managers that manage on behalf of super funds, as well as kind of the big banks. So for them, clearly, it's a finance first type of an approach, and there are legal and regulatory requirements that require that. What I think is quite interesting is there are increasingly arguments being made by fiduciary investors that thinking about and considering impact can actually help to manage systemic risks, particularly if you're a universal asset owner. So that's where I think the gap, I guess, between impact first and finance first is possibly narrowing, and thinking about impact from both a risk and an opportunity perspective, and help to help those types of financial institutions comply with their fiduciary duties as well. Contrasting that, I guess, to when my time in DFAT, we were very much an impact first kind of participant in the market, and the development program is largely measured on the development impact that it's creating. So that was clearly in the impact first part of the market.
okay. And Jeremy, from you've got a broad ranging perspective now, but can you comment as well in terms of some of the organisations you're associated with?
Yeah, look, I couldn't agree more with both Richard and Kristy. I like Richard's kind of reverting to that double bottom line terminology, because I think actually the impact first and finance first are very much kind of coming together. And with EMIF, for example, it sort of touches on the blended finance question, but I think it is an impact focused approach. But certainly EMIF is looking for excellent investors, people who can invest well, people who have commercial disciplines, people who can generate both the commercial and the impact outcomes, and then provide some incentives to them in some way to help them to actually achieve the impact side. So I don't think that you can put aside the commercial side of it if you're looking for kind of private sector investments. You still need those commercial disciplines, and then then the question is, how do you drive the impact outcomes at the same time?
Great. All right. Thanks. We might talk now a little bit about blended finance. So I showed a slide on that before and defined it. It's essentially this just strategic use of development finance, such as concessional finance, for the mobilization of additional, perhaps more return-focused finance coming together in order to drive sustainable development in developing countries. So perhaps I could ask, I might start with Kristy this time. Can you comment on the role of blended finance and how it can attract commercial capital towards development projects? And do you think it's going to grow, and it's been successful, and it is really a key driver for future development?
Thanks, Clay. Yeah, it is growing. There's still a huge gap in terms of the finance needs for emerging markets and what's currently available. So there's a lot more scope for that to grow. I think the focus of our work at DFAT was very much about building understanding, awareness of the role of blended finance. It's not going to solve all problems, but it is a useful tool that can complement, for example, work that you might be doing to enhance policy and regulation to allow private capital the certainty and reduce risks for them investing in a particular geography. So it's got a very important, not just bridge role, but ability to also make some opportunities that are less commercial because of the sector they're in, the geography they're in, the type of business or activity that they're investing in, to make those more attractive to commercial capital. So yeah, I think it's got a temporal as well as kind of an impact role to bring other capital to ultimately what is a challenge that won't be able to be solved by public capital alone.
Okay. Thanks. Richard, I mean, did you want to comment? I mean, does Responsibility ever invest together with sort of a more blended finance investor? Have you seen that?
The answer is yes. I think everyone on the call is familiar with the concept of a collateralized loan obligation. What we have been doing increasingly over the last several years is to take our already very active relationship with DFIs who have been investors in our funds from almost the beginning, to move into using their involvement to fund either a first loss or a junior tranche in a structured fund that allows differentiated rates of return for different classes of investors. And increasingly in the non-traditional, that is to say, non-financial institutions investment focus, that has been an often used structural element. Thank you.
Right. And Jeremy, did you want to comment in this area of blended finance as well?
Yeah, thanks, Clay. I think just to key off my previous comment, you know, those commercial disciplines are important, and so as you think about providing some concessional finance alongside that, it really is important to think about how you create or otherwise influence incentives. And so the creation of first loss pieces that Richard was talking about is one good example. But also from what Kristy was saying, thinking about providing technical assistance to help a business develop a business line which may not otherwise be commercial for them to invest in, but actually can develop and grow really successfully if it's given a push. And so actually thinking about the multiple different ways that you can bring capital to bear without negatively influencing those commercial incentives and trying to make them work together, if that makes sense.
Great, thanks. I see we have some questions in the Q&A, but if people want to participate, I encourage you to do that, and we'll get to those shortly. But just before that, I wanted to ask another question, and maybe we'll go to you first, Jeremy. What do you see are the challenges for those seeking to grow the availability of development finance for impact in emerging markets? I mean, I think we're all on board with the role it can play, but how can those particular, what are those challenges, and how do you think they can be addressed in order to increase the amount of impact investing that's going on?
It's a good question. Thanks, Clay. Look, I think education and these types of events are really important. I was talking to a fund manager in Asia recently who are looking to raise capital, and they'd been engaged with a big foundation in Asia that had not invested from an impact perspective. They had been a donor in the past, but were looking at impact. And they wanted to provide a very large chunk of capital to the fund manager, which really didn't fit with the fund manager's strategy of investing in much smaller businesses for kind of on-the-ground impact. And so I think it's a process of educating both commercial investors on the one side about the links and the systemic risks that Kristy talked about earlier, but also from the perspective of foundations and NGOs, thinking about moving slightly towards the investment side. You know, what are the needs, and how are they best able to engage? So from my perspective, these types of activities and a number of the institutions that are involved with this are great. And, you know, hopefully over time, the increase in availability of impact capital will also draw more institutions into the market and help with that education process.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I mean, I think there's been big, last 20 years, we've seen huge development. I mean, I remember at Opportunity, you know, if you went to an investor to talk about microfinance, they couldn't work out, you know, if you went to, say, a bank, they couldn't work out whether to send you down to the end of the hall where there was the foundation or to send you down to the other end of the hall where there were the investment guys. But now there's a whole range of options. So I think it makes it easier in a way for people who want to get involved at the level that suits them. Richard, I don't know, what do you think are the key challenges that you've confronted and how to overcome them?
Well, I think the last 2.5 years with the COVID pandemic, we've seen a very prominent and easily digested example of a shock that can temporarily dilute investor returns. I think a challenge is not just limited to global health crises, but just general economic and financial cycles. Maintaining donor and investor confidence in the space whilst we navigate cyclical economic downturns and shocks is important. We spend a fair amount of time in our work making certain that people understand when returns dip down below expected, why that is, and keeping our faith in the longer term. But more importantly, in some ways, is when confronted with challenges on the ground in the investee companies, to be able to deal with those effectively and maintain the integrity of the investments. So I think that is something which may unfortunately be a greater frequency than not as we move forward. Thank you.
All right, and Kristy, I guess your organization is focused on overcoming, I suppose, some of those challenges to encourage more impact investing. But how do you see the best way to address those issues?
I think one of the key challenges when you're talking about impact investing in emerging markets is generally unfamiliarity with those markets and the opportunities that might exist in those markets. And for particularly, I guess, mainstream financial institutions, understanding and knowing the intermediaries that will be able to help navigate the opportunities within those markets as well. So for lots of organisations, the step into impact is enough. The step into impact plus emerging markets at the same time is sometimes a step that's a bit too challenging. So I would say there's, in terms of how you solve that, working in partnership with organisations that understand those markets, that understand impact. And I know sort of DFAT's work is continuing to better understand the barriers faced by different types of investors looking at emerging market impact opportunities. And so I would encourage people to kind of tap into that wealth of expertise, the on-ground network, the large sort of development programs and the expertise and network that exist within those to help smooth that path and find a way through into kind of local organisations who have that ability to, as you highlighted, Richard, kind of manage things on the ground and work alongside enterprises when they need that, but also to be able to work back into sort of the capital requirements or investment requirements that Australian investors might have.
Great, thanks. Look, we might go to some of the questions that have come in from participants, so thank you all for your contribution. The first one is from Graham Forward. His question is, hospital and medical developments are often gender neutral rather than gender equity focused, and sometimes climate neutral rather than climate focused. So do you think that is a problem for impact investment? Perhaps the fact that they're not ticking those boxes of gender and climate. I'll open it to whoever wants to jump in.
Yeah, I'm happy to have a go. Look, I think both climate change and gender lens investing are key focus areas of the moment for good reason. But I don't think that lessens the focus, the kind of impact focus on other areas like healthcare or education or a broad range of other areas that you talked about earlier in the discussion, Clay. And so I think, you know, it's important for us to be thinking about opportunities to engage women in economically valuable activities, opportunities to improve things from a climate change perspective. But, you know, the development and rollout of healthcare for underserved communities is incredibly important at the same time. So from my perspective, I think they sit within the same box.
Yeah, I mean, I guess funds often have a sector focus, but I mean, the numbers I showed indicate around 7% of impact investing is going into healthcare. But do you think those two issues are obstacles, Richard or Kristy? And
oh, I'm sorry.
Go
Kristy,
ahead.
please
Go ahead, Richard. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say that I think in particular, as was mentioned by Jeremy, you know, extending either clinic-based or full hospital competent medical care does touch women, and so I would dispute that it's not something that is, you know, gender focused. It's focused on the community, and there's some investors who, if they have a allotment into doing something which is climate friendly, may move away from hospitals, but I think that, as Jeremy said, it is an absolutely fundamental building block of social development and community welfare, and deserves the support of the impact investment community.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess the issue, if you compare, say, investing into healthcare with development, with say microfinance, it's harder to have a financial return from a you know, a healthcare impact investment. But it is possible. You can use structures like development bonds, you know, where development targets are set up and people pay a return based on those development targets as opposed to pure financial targets. But Kristy, have you looked at any impact investing into the healthcare area yourself?
No, not specifically, but I think you're right, Clay. It depends on the underlying fundamentals of the sector in that country and how healthcare is delivered, whether that's publicly or privately. So that will obviously kind of play into whether it's an asset or an opportunity that is suitable for impact investment as a sort of a capital source.
Sure. Okay. All right. The next question comes from Prachi Maheshwari, who's at Investing in Women, which was one of the 3 Australian government programs I mentioned before. Her question is, given that Australia is decades behind the rest of the world in impact investing, what interventions by public and private actors could progress the field locally? I might start with you on this one, Kristy, just because I guess it's the key focus of your current organisation.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, Prachi. I guess as a starting point, ensuring that financial sector policy and regulation are supportive and enable the consideration and integration of impact factors into investment decision making, particularly for fiduciaries, is really critical. So there's a range of regulations, and the Sustainable Finance Roadmap sort of goes into more detail around this. And I know PRI has also been doing work to say, well, what might be some of the legal impediments preventing better integration of impact by fiduciary investors in Australia. The other thing I would highlight is that there was work done by an expert panel back in 2020 that looked at, well, what role could the Australian government play in stimulating the growth of the impact investing market domestically, and borrowing very much from some of the things we've done in the region. So looking at sort of whether an impact wholesaler and Impact Investing Australia has been sort of pushing for an impact investing wholesaler to play a similar role to what EMA does in the region domestically, as well as a whole range of things around social impact bonds, better coordination right across the federal government system to build on a lot of the work that's been really driven at the state government level.
All right. And Jeremy, you're also working here in Australia now, having come back after a long absence. What's your perspective on those key interventions from the public and private sector?
Yeah, thanks, Clay. I mean, I would say that most of my focus is still in emerging markets, so in the Pacific and in Asia. So Kristy will know much better than I do. There are players in the market that are trying to drive the development of the impact space in Australia. I think it is tricky, and some of the dynamics in our superannuation sector over the recent past probably haven't helped, but I think that is changing, and so people like Kristy and the organisation that she is now working for, I think are kind of core to that and trying to move that forward.
And Richard, did you want to offer anything from your experience outside Australia, just in terms of?
I was going to say, as a non-Australian, my perception of Australia's intervention and performance in the impact investment space is very different. I think that we often hold Australia up as a country that, despite a small population and perhaps limited means, has a very large and positive contribution. So that can be the non-Australian view on the topic.
Thanks for that. So you'll get your visa when you want to come down here, up to that comment. And then one other question, this is good. This is from an anonymous attendee, but it's looking at it from the perspective of a small private investor. So someone like that who's interested in supporting impact investment, what would be the recommendations about how they should go about finding an appropriate vehicle for their investment? So obviously they can't invest direct, but without spruiking your own funds that you might be involved with, how do you think a small private investor can get into the impact investing world? Kristy, maybe I'll start again with you, just because it's probably a little bit more in your area at the moment.
Sure. Yeah, I would say be very clear, firstly, your impact themes that you want to achieve, the regions and the type of exposure and risk, I guess, from a financial and kind of market perspective that you're willing to take. And then, as I said, this is sort of becoming increasingly mainstream. And so many wealth advisors now will advise on a range of different impact products. But I would be also not afraid to talk to impact specific wealth advisors, and there's sort of a growing group of them as well who have the expertise to be able to assess kind of the impact credibility of the different products, as well as sort of the financial credibility as well. So if you're not getting what you need from your kind of standard wealth advisor, I would say there are a range of others who specialise in this area now that you can go to.
I mean, as a sort of trendy area, a lot of people are sort of talking about being an impact investor or an impact investment advisor. I mean, is there a website or a source that you can go to get some advice in this area?
So the Responsible Investors Association of Australasia have a certification program where they certify impact managers, and it's a process-based certification at the moment, but that's a good place to start. The other place I would suggest is tapping into resources like DFAT and some of the programs that they've funded, some of the partners that they've worked with who have sort of strong regional presence and can help kind of point people in the right direction as well.
Okay, great. Richard, Jeremy, did you want to add anything to that?
I would only re-emphasize a point that Kristy made, which is you need to know where you want to have your money play. Ultimately, it's a very personal decision, perhaps the most personal investment decision you make. And then secondly, be clear about the risk parameters, both what your tolerance is and then what the reality, the characteristics of the investment in terms of return and liquidity. When can you get your money back if you want to get your money back?
Agreed. I would just say, I think a lot of wealth managers at the moment are developing sustainable products, but it's actually very difficult in many ways, in many cases, to find out what that means. And so just back to what Kristy was saying about about advisors and making sure that you do your homework, because I think it's de rigueur, I think, to label investment funds sustainable, et cetera, but actually it's hard to put your finger on what that might mean.
Sure. Great. All right. Look, there's about 3 minutes left before we wrap up. So I was just going to ask each of the panelists maybe just to give a final view on the potential for impact investment focused on international development. How do you see it? Richard raised COVID, which didn't help. It didn't help in a lot of areas. But what about the next 5 years? Where do you think it's heading? Richard, maybe we'll start with you from the sort of more global perspective.
I think the world in general and the investor community more specifically over the last years has come to understand the fragility of our world and the need for addressing elements from health through income security, through climate change, and therefore I think that the very positive trajectory of investing more generally into what we'll call sustainable, just impact, in other words, will continue. I think everyone on this call can do their part by focusing the dialogue on how economic growth must be predicated on ultimate sustainability, both environmental and social. So in other words, we all have a role to play. Thank you.
And Jeremy, if impact investing in 2020 was at 700 billion, what's your prediction for 2025? How big's the market going to come? Come on.
I'm gonna write this down, Jeremy.
Look, I'm going to demur to give you a number, but I think it will continue to grow very strongly for the reasons that Richard set forth. I think more and more now concepts are coalescing with the strength of GIN and the 2X initiative on the gender side and others, and the drive forward on climate change. I actually think the impact investing sector is going to increase very significantly. I think there is, as Richard said, greater pull for commercial investors, just with respect to those systemic risks that were mentioned before, and kind of pulling capital into that space. So I'm not going to give you a number, Clay, but I do think it will grow very substantially.
All right, Kristy, I won't ask you to give a number, but any final thoughts in terms of the projections for impact investing?
I would agree with the sort of optimism in terms of growth. There are a lot of factors kind of driving that, including intergenerational wealth transfer to millennials. And we know in Australia and globally that will be a real driver of putting people's values alongside or as an integral part of their investment decisions. I think in terms of emerging markets, there's clearly very strong potential to have impact in emerging markets. And there's also really strong commercial opportunities. If you look at a region like Southeast Asia, for example, a large kind of rapidly growing, but also kind of increasingly wealthy population that can deliver that sort of sweet spot of returns as well as impact. So yeah, I think very positive outlook around.
All right, well, thanks very much. We need to wrap it up. So I want to thank the panel initially, but I also thank those who participated. I hope this session's given you a little bit of a insight into the development of impact investment over the last 2 decades and the exciting opportunities for the future. The session was recorded and it will be shared at the end of the series. And always, if you have any questions in this area of international giving or impact investing, please reach out to AIDN or to Stuart, who has kindly co-sponsored this session at Good Business. And just a reminder that this is the second session, and there'll be a third session in the series that will be held in about 4 weeks' time on the 6th of July at the same time of 11 a.m. So hopefully those who are here today can join that, and please spread the word, and hopefully we'll have others involved at that time. So thank you everybody for the panel and participants. Thanks Julie from AIDN as well, and Stuart. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks.